My name is Tyler Carter, and I was 27 years old when it happened. I don't tell this story often, not because I'm ashamed of it, but because it's hard to make people believe. It happened 2 years ago, in the summer of 2021, during a camping trip to Black Mesa State Park in Oklahoma. What started as a simple trip to reconnect with nature and my best friend, Caleb Meyer, turned into the kind of nightmare you don't walk away from unchanged. Caleb and I had been friends since middle school. He was always the cautious one, the type who carried extra batteries for everything and believed in things like ghosts and folklore. Me? I was the opposite. I wanted facts, proof, logic. That's why, when Caleb suggested Black Mesa for a few days of hiking and camping, I jumped at the chance. The place was remote, quiet, and promised some of the best sunsets in the state. I thought it would be a nice break from work and screens, a perfect getaway. We rolled into the park in Caleb's old RV late one Friday afternoon. The thing was a clunker, but it worked. We set up camp near the ridge where the rock formation stretched high into the sky, casting long shadows across the scrubby desert floor. The air was heavy and still, the kind of quiet that makes you notice the absence of sound. "That's weird," Caleb said, scanning the trees. "What is?" "There's no birds, no crickets." I shrugged. Maybe they're smarter than us and got out of this heat. But Caleb frowned, his hand resting on the pouch of sage he always carried. He was superstitious like that, always burning sage to cleanse spaces. I thought it was a little over the top, but it was harmless, so I didn't argue. We spent the evening hiking up the ridge, watching the sun sink behind the hills, and by the time we made it back to the RV, I was exhausted. That night, it started. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of scratching, light, deliberate scrapes against the side of the RV. I figured it was a raccoon or a coyote, but when I shone my flashlight through the window, there was nothing there. I brushed it off and went back to bed. The next morning, Caleb found tracks around the RV. They started as coyote prints but changed halfway through into something that looked eerily human. "See this?" Caleb said, pointing at the tracks. "This isn't normal." "Maybe someone's messing with us," I suggested. "Some local kids having fun with the city boys." Caleb didn't laugh. "You don't mess with stuff like this out here." By the second night, things started getting weirder. We were sitting by the campfire when we heard it, a voice calling Caleb's name from the darkness. "Caleb." The voice was soft, almost playful, but it sounded just like me. Caleb froze, his face going pale. "Don't answer it," he whispered. "Why not?" I said, half joking. "It's probably the wind." "That's not the wind." We sat there, listening as the voice called again. This time it came from the opposite direction. Caleb grabbed my arm, his grip like a vice. "We need to go," he said. "Now." "You're overreacting." "Tyler, I'm serious. This isn't a joke. It's a skinwalker." I rolled my eyes. "A skinwalker? Really? You've been watching too many movies." But Caleb wasn't laughing. He stood up, clutching his pouch of sage like a lifeline, and started chanting under his breath. I let him do his thing, though I thought it was ridiculous. I didn't believe in skinwalkers or ghosts or any of that nonsense. Not yet, anyway. That night, I woke up again, this time to heavy breathing outside the RV. It was deep, guttural, and impossibly close. My heart pounded as I sat up, peering out the window. What I saw froze me in place. A figure stood just outside the firelight. It was tall and unnaturally thin, its limbs too long for its body. Its eyes glowed yellow, and as it moved, its form seemed to shift. One moment a coyote, the next a man, and then something in between. "Caleb," I whispered, shaking him awake. "There's something out there." He sat up instantly, grabbing his flashlight. "Don't look at it. Don't acknowledge it." "What the hell is it?" "A skinwalker," he said, his voice trembling. "It's watching us." The thing let out a low growl, and I swear it smiled. A sharp, unnatural grin that sent a chill down my spine. Caleb started burning sage, muttering prayers under his breath. The figure didn't move, but its eyes stayed locked on us until the fire burned out and plunged the RV into darkness. The next morning, we found strange symbols scratched into the dirt around the RV. They looked like runes or markings, but neither of us could make sense of them. Caleb was visibly shaken, and I was starting to feel it too, the sense that we were being hunted. "We should leave," Caleb said, packing his things. "We're not safe here." But I wasn't ready to give up. "We're fine. It's probably just some crazy local messing with us." "Tyler, this isn't human." I didn't believe him. Not entirely, but that night I wished I had. The RV was quiet as we tried to sleep, but then the scratching started again. This time it was louder, more aggressive, like claws raking against metal. Then came the knocking. Slow, deliberate knocks on the door, followed by a voice. "Tyler, Caleb, come outside." It was my voice. Caleb panicked, grabbing his bag and pulling me toward the door. "We have to go." I hesitated. "What about the RV?" "Screw the RV," he shouted. "Do you want to die out here?" That got me moving. We bolted, leaving everything behind, and ran toward the ridge. The night was eerily silent except for the sound of footsteps behind us. Heavy, deliberate, and far too close. When I looked back, the skinwalker was there, its form shifting between man and beast. "It's following us," I said, my breath coming in gasps. "Keep moving," Caleb said. "Don't stop. Don't look at it." We ran until we hit the highway, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon. The footsteps stopped, and when I looked back, the thing was gone. But the fear didn't leave. We flagged down a trucker who drove us to the nearest town. When we returned to the park with the authorities, the RV was gone. No tracks, no signs of anything. Just an empty campsite and a lingering sense of dread. To this day, I can still hear that voice calling my name in the dark, and when I close my eyes, I see those glowing yellow eyes staring back at me. So, if you're ever in Black Mesa and you hear your name called from the woods, don't answer, and whatever you do, don't look back. My name is Daniel Reyes. I'm 29 years old, and I make a living exploring the unknown. I run a YouTube channel where I investigate haunted locations, abandoned places, and urban legends. It's a job I love, but it's also one I've come to regret, especially after what happened at Devil's Hollow in the fall of 2023. Devil's Hollow is a remote area near Black Kettle National Grassland in Oklahoma, a place avoided by locals and surrounded by whispered warnings of disappearances and satanic rituals. For me, it was perfect. The rumors of a cursed RV graveyard hidden deep in the forest were too tempting to resist. I thought I could uncover the truth, get some great footage, and maybe even go viral. I couldn't have been more wrong. I arrived at Devil's Hollow on a crisp October afternoon. The trees towered overhead, their twisted branches casting jagged shadows across the forest floor. The air smelled of damp earth, and the silence was unnerving. I parked my RV at the edge of the woods, feeling both excited and uneasy. Before setting off, I recorded a quick intro for my vlog. Hey everyone, it's Daniel, back with another deep dive into the unexplained. Today, we're exploring Devil's Hollow, a place with a dark reputation. Rumors of rituals, ghosts, and even cursed RVs have made this spot infamous. Let's see what we can find. With my camera in hand, I ventured into the forest. The further I walked, the darker it seemed to get, even though it was still daylight. I found the first abandoned RV about a mile in. It was rusted, its windows shattered, and its door hung open like a yawning mouth. Inside, the walls were scratched with strange symbols. I took out my camera, narrating as I filmed. This RV looks like it's been here for decades. Check out these carvings. They look almost ritualistic. Let's see if there's anything inside. Among the debris, I found a weathered notebook. Its pages were brittle, but the writing was legible. The entries described the final days of the RV's owner, someone who claimed to hear voices and see figures in the woods. The last entry sent a chill down my spine. They want me to join them. I didn't know who they were, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, as I reviewed the footage back at my RV, strange noises began outside, low growls and faint whispers. I grabbed a flashlight and looked out the window, but I couldn't see anything. Then I noticed something in the footage. In one clip, as I panned the camera across the forest, there was a figure in the background. A person in a black cloak, watching me from the shadows. I hadn't seen them when I was filming. A shiver ran down my spine. Was someone else out here? The whispers grew louder, circling the RV. When I looked outside again, I saw faint lights flickering between the trees, like lanterns swaying in the darkness. Against my better judgment, I opened the door and stepped out. The lights moved further into the woods, as if leading me somewhere. The next day, I followed the lights to a clearing I hadn't seen before. At its center stood a circle of stone pillars, weathered and cracked. The ground inside the circle was scorched, littered with animal bones and ash. I filmed the site, my nerves on edge. This must be where the rituals happened, I whispered into the camera. Look at these stones. They're ancient. And the burn marks. It's like something was sacrificed here. As I filmed, I began to feel lightheaded. The air seemed thicker, heavier. Then I heard it, soft chanting coming from the edge of the clearing. I turned, but no one was there. When I reviewed the footage later, I saw it again. The cloaked figure standing among the trees, watching me. By the third night, things had escalated. I woke to the sound of knocking, soft, rhythmic taps on the RV walls. My heart pounded as I listened, the sound moving from the door to the windows and back again. Then came the whispers, growing louder and more distinct. "Join us," they said. "We've been waiting for you." I shouted into the darkness, "Who's there? What do you want?" The whispers stopped. For a moment there was silence. Then I heard a voice, deep and guttural, reply, "Your soul." The next morning, I found symbols scratched into the hood of my RV, matching the ones I'd seen in the abandoned RV. My supplies had been scattered, as if someone, or something, had ransacked the vehicle. I decided it was time to leave, but every path out of the forest seemed to lead me back to the stone pillars. It was as if the forest itself was conspiring to keep me there. My GPS glitched, showing me looping in circles, and I started to panic. When I finally made it back to the clearing, the chanting began again, louder this time. Shadows moved between the trees, and the cloaked figure stepped into the open. Its face was hidden beneath the hood, but I could feel its gaze on me. "You sought the truth," it said, its voice echoing unnaturally, "and now you found it." "Stay back!" I shouted, brandishing my flashlight like a weapon. The figure laughed, a sound that sent chills down my spine. "You can't leave, Daniel. Not until you join us." The shadows closed in, forming a circle around me. I stumbled backward, my mind racing. Then I remembered the journal from the abandoned RV, the warning about them wanting me to join. I realized they preyed on ambition, offering power and fame in exchange for souls. "You won't take me," I said, grabbing the camera from my bag. I hurled it at the stone pillars, shattering it against the rocks. The chanting faltered, the shadows hesitating. "No!" the figure roared, its voice filled with fury. "You will not escape!" I ran, the shadows chasing me. Somehow, I found the strength to keep moving, to push through the thick woods and blinding darkness. When I finally burst out of the forest, the sun was rising. My RV stood untouched, as if nothing had happened. I don't know how I escaped Devil's Hollow. I don't know why they let me go, but I'll never forget what I saw, and I'll never go back. My footage was gone, corrupted beyond recovery, but the memories remain. Sometimes I still hear whispers at night, and I wonder if I truly escaped or if they're still waiting for me to return. Some stories aren't meant to be told. Devil's Hollow is one of them. My name is Claire Maddox, and I'm 45 years old. This happened in the fall of 2023 during a solo photography trip to the Wichita National Forest in Oklahoma. I'm a wildlife photographer, a good one if I do say so myself, and I'd recently heard rumors that the endangered red-cockaded woodpecker had been spotted in the remote groves of the forest. I was determined to capture it on camera, both for my work and to prove I could handle being out here alone. The truth is, I needed this trip. After my husband's death 2 years ago, I hadn't felt like myself. He'd been my adventure partner, my anchor. This was my first solo expedition since his passing, and I told myself it was about photography, but deep down, I was hoping for something else. A sign, maybe, that I could still live a life without him. I didn't know I'd get my sign, though not the kind I wanted. I drove my RV along the Talamena Scenic Drive, the road cutting through the misty mountains like a ribbon. The trees were alive with autumn colors, gold, crimson, and burnt orange. It was breathtaking. I found a quiet pull-off, parked my RV, and set up camp for what I planned to be a week of solitude and shooting. The location was perfect. Dense woods, no other campers in sight, and only the sound of the wind and occasional bird calls to keep me company. The first day passed uneventfully. I hiked, scouted for good vantage points, and set up trail cameras. The woods were beautiful, but unsettlingly quiet. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, but I brushed it off as nerves. It had been a long time since I'd been out here on my own. That night, as I reviewed the photos I'd taken, I noticed something strange. In one shot, a grove of trees I'd passed earlier, there was a faint shadow, small, human-shaped, standing among the trunks. It looked like a child. I squinted, telling myself it was a trick of the light. But why would a child be out here, miles from civilization? I told myself it was nothing and went to bed. The second day brought more oddities. My trail cameras, which I'd checked that morning, had all drained their batteries overnight. They were brand new, fully charged before I left. My GPS, reliable in every situation, glitched and showed me walking in circles when I tried to explore deeper into the woods. I cursed under my breath and headed back to camp earlier than planned, frustrated and uneasy. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the atmosphere changed. The woods, already quiet, grew silent. The kind of silence that presses against your ears, making your own breathing sound too loud. I heard it then. A soft, muffled sound, like someone crying. It was faint, carried on the breeze, but unmistakable. "Hello?" I called, stepping out of the RV. "Is someone there?" The crying stopped. I waited, my flashlight scanning the tree line, but there was nothing. Later that night, I woke to the sound of laughter. High-pitched, childlike, and close. My heart raced as I sat up in bed listening. The laughter circled the RV, fading in and out, like someone was running laps around it. I grabbed the flashlight by my bed and shone it through the window, but the light caught only shifting shadows. When morning came, I found muddy handprints on the RV door. They were small, like a child's. By the third day, I was on edge. I considered leaving, but convinced myself to stay. I didn't want to give in to fear, and besides, the forest was too beautiful to abandon. That afternoon, as I hiked to retrieve my trail cameras, I ran into a park ranger. He was older, with a weathered face and a sharp look in his eyes. "You, camping alone out here?" he asked, his tone more suspicious than friendly. "Yes," I said, trying to sound confident. "I'm a wildlife photographer." He didn't smile. "You should stick to the main areas. Don't go wandering too deep." "Why not?" He hesitated. "There are stories about these woods. Locals call it the forest children. Spirits of kids who got lost or abandoned. They say they linger, looking for company, and if you follow them, you don't come back." I laughed nervously. "That's just a story." The ranger didn't laugh. "Sometimes stories have roots in truth. Be careful." That night, the forest came alive. It started with whispers, soft and indistinct, like a dozen voices speaking just out of earshot. I lay in bed, clutching the flashlight, too scared to sleep. The whispers grew louder, mingling with laughter and the sound of small feet pattering around the RV. Then the knocking started. Soft, rhythmic taps against the door and windows, coming from all sides. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The knocking stopped. For a moment, there was silence, and then, from right outside the door, a child's voice said, "Please let us in. We're lost." My blood turned to ice. It sounded so innocent, so plaintive. But I knew better. I stayed frozen, gripping the flashlight like it was a weapon until dawn finally broke. The next day, I decided I'd had enough. As I packed up camp, I reviewed the photos from my trail cameras, hoping to find some explanation. What I saw made my stomach churn. In every frame, there were shadows, small, human-shaped, standing among the trees. They were never there when I took the shots, but they appeared in the photos, always closer than before. In one, they were staring directly at the camera, their eyes black hollows. I couldn't leave fast enough. The hike back to the RV was a nightmare. The forest seemed to shift around me, landmarks disappearing or reappearing in the wrong places. The whispers followed me, growing louder, and twice I saw movement in the corner of my eye, small figures darting between the trees. Then I found it, a clearing I hadn't seen before. At its center was a circle of stones, and around the edge, the trees were carved with crude figures, children holding hands. The air was colder here, heavy, like a weight pressing down on my chest. As I stood there, frozen, the shadows emerged. They were children, or something pretending to be. Their faces were pale, their eyes dark and empty. They smiled, but it wasn't a child's smile. It was too wide, too sharp. "Stay with us," they whispered, their voices overlapping. "We're so lonely." My legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. The shadows edged closer, their whispers filling my ears, drowning out my thoughts. And then I heard my husband's voice in my head, clear and steady. "Keep moving forward." I snapped out of it. Grabbing my camera bag, I flung it into the stone circle, hoping to distract them. The shadows hesitated, drawn to the bag, and I ran. I didn't look back. I made it back to the RV, my heart pounding, and drove away without stopping. When I finally reached civilization, I reviewed the photos again. Every image of the clearing was corrupted, but one thing was clear. The figures were there, standing in the circle, watching me. I haven't been back to the forest since. I still hear whispers sometimes, late at night, and I can't shake the feeling that I brought something back with me, but I've started to face my grief, to move forward, just as my husband would have wanted. Some places are not meant to be explored. The Wichita National Forest is one of them. My name is Claire Jensen, and I'm 28 years old. I've spent the last 6 months living in my RV, traveling across the country in search of inspiration for my artwork. This story happened last fall, during a stop in the Wichita National Forest in Oklahoma. It was supposed to be just another quiet retreat into nature, a place where I could sketch the towering pines and serene landscapes. But what I found in that forest wasn't serenity. It was something else entirely. I parked my RV in a secluded spot a few miles from the nearest trailhead. It was the perfect setting. Sunlight streaming through the trees, birds flitting between the branches, and not another soul in sight. That was exactly how I liked it. Solitude helped me focus, and there was so much beauty to capture here. The first day went smoothly. I spent hours exploring the area, snapping photos and sketching the strange, twisted trees that seemed to grow in intricate patterns. One tree caught my eye in particular. Its trunk was hollow, and its bark was covered in carvings, sharp, jagged symbols that looked ancient. I studied them for a while, trying to decipher their meaning, but eventually gave up and moved on. The first night I heard the whispers. I was sitting in the RV, working on a sketch of the hollow tree when the sound reached me. At first, it was so faint I thought it was the wind, soft murmurs that seemed to float through the air. But as I listened, I realized it wasn't the wind. It was voices. I froze, my pencil hovering above the page. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, but I couldn't make out any words. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed a flashlight and peered out the window. There was nothing there, just the dark forest, silent and still. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the wind and the trees. But even as I climbed into bed, the whispers lingered, a constant hum just at the edge of hearing. The next morning, I tried to shake off the unease. It was probably just the isolation getting to me, I reasoned. I'd been on the road for months with only my sketches for company. A little paranoia was normal, right? I set out on a hike, determined to clear my head. The forest was beautiful in the daylight, golden sunlight filtering through the canopy, leaves crunching underfoot. But as I walked, I began to notice strange patterns in the trees. Some were bent into perfect arches, their branches intertwined like clasped hands. Others had symbols carved into their bark, similar to the ones I'd seen on the hollow tree. The air felt heavy, as if the forest itself was watching me. That's when I found the journal. It was lying in the dirt near an old, abandoned campsite. The leather cover was cracked and weathered, but the pages inside were still legible. The name Mason was scrawled on the first page, followed by frantic, disjointed entries about his time in the forest. "It watches," one entry read. "It doesn't like when you take things, and never make noise after dark." Another page described a figure made of vines and moss, with glowing green eyes that followed him wherever he went. Mason warned against drawing its attention, but he didn't explain why. That night, the figure appeared. I was sitting by the fire reading more of Mason's journal when I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I looked up, and there it was, standing at the edge of the trees. It was tall and humanoid, its body a mass of tangled vines and moss. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, like two emerald flames. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stared. I didn't know what to do. My instincts screamed at me to run, but Mason's warnings echoed in my mind. Don't draw attention to yourself. So I stayed perfectly still, my heart hammering in my chest. After what felt like an eternity, the figure turned and melted back into the shadows. The next day, I found more evidence of its presence. Around my RV, the forest seemed to have shifted overnight. Trees that had been standing tall were now bent into arches, forming a sort of barrier around my campsite. The air was thick with an unnatural silence. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive stillness. I tried to focus on my art, hoping to distract myself. I sketched the figure from memory, capturing its twisted form and haunting eyes. It was beautiful in its own terrifying way, a perfect embodiment of the forest's untamed spirit. But that night I realized I'd made a mistake. The spirit was angry. It started with scratches on my RV, long, jagged marks that gouged the paint. Then came the whispers, louder and more menacing than before. They seemed to come from everywhere at once, filling the air with a chorus of unintelligible voices. I huddled inside, clutching Mason's journal like a lifeline. One entry caught my eye. It doesn't want you to leave. It wants you to stay, to become part of the forest. That's when I understood. The spirit wasn't just watching me, it was trying to claim me. I knew I had to do something. The journal mentioned a ritual, a way to appease the spirit and break its hold. Mason had tried it, but hadn't written whether it worked. Desperation outweighed fear as I grabbed my sketch of the spirit and a few supplies, then set out into the forest. The whispers followed me, growing louder with each step. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. I was completely alone, surrounded by darkness and the oppressive hum of the forest. When I reached the hollow tree, the spirit was waiting. It loomed over me, its form larger and more menacing than before. The glowing eyes bored into mine, and for a moment, I couldn't move. Then I remembered the journal. Slowly, I placed my sketch of the spirit at the base of the tree and stepped back. "This is for you," I whispered, my voice trembling. The spirit didn't move. The whispers grew deafening, a cacophony of anger and pain. Then, as suddenly as they'd begun, they stopped. The spirit stared at the sketch for a long moment, then dissolved into the shadows. I left the forest the next morning, my nerves frayed but my body intact. As I drove away, I noticed the vines still clinging to my RV, their leaves etched with faint, familiar symbols. The spirit had let me go, but I knew it wasn't gone. It was still out there, watching, waiting for the next intruder to wander too far into its domain. And I couldn't help but wonder if Mason had ever made it out. My name is Elliot Gray, and I'm a 32-year-old journalist. I've been chasing urban legends for years, mostly out of curiosity, sometimes for clicks, and occasionally for a good scare. What happened to me and my friends at Shaman's Portal in Beaver Dunes Park, Oklahoma, was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. I haven't written about it until now because, honestly, I wasn't sure I'd survive telling the story. It was late October, the kind of month where the nights creep in early and the air smells of decay and nostalgia. I had just finished a piece on haunted bridges in the Midwest when I got a tip about the so-called Oklahoma-Bermuda Triangle. Locals whispered about strange disappearances and glowing lights over the dunes. But most alarming were the rumors of a cursed portal, a place where people vanished into thin air. It sounded like perfect material for my blog. Rachel Bennett, my best friend and a photographer, agreed to come along. She was tough as nails, practical, and not one for ghost stories, but she loved eerie landscapes. Then there was Jim Carter, a self-proclaimed local historian. He was 29, a little awkward, but passionate about the park's strange history. He offered to guide us, warning that the dunes could be deceptively dangerous. We arrived at Beaver Dunes Park around noon. The landscape was surreal. Endless hills of golden sand, dotted with sparse tufts of grass and bordered by ominous scrubland. The wind howled, carrying a chill that didn't match the clear sky. People say the native tribes warned settlers about this place, Jim explained as we unpacked our gear. Called it Shaman's Portal. They said spirits guarded the land. Then, in the 1500s, Spanish explorers disappeared here without a trace. Supposedly, their armor is still buried under the sand. Rachel rolled her eyes. I'm guessing the wind buried them, not ghosts. Jim grinned nervously. It's not just ghosts. The military supposedly investigated this place back in the 90s. Magnetic anomalies, strange lights, the works. You'll see. The dunes, they're alive. Rachel muttered something under her breath about great storytelling, but I was intrigued. I'd heard these legends before, but standing in the heart of it made my skin crawl. We set up camp at the edge of the dunes. Jim insisted we wouldn't want to stay overnight in the deeper areas. Too easy to get lost, he said, but his uneasy glance at the shifting sands suggested other reasons. The trouble started almost immediately. Rachel's high-end camera, fresh off a service, refused to focus. Every shot of the dunes came out blurry or streaked with odd distortions. Meanwhile, my audio recorder began capturing strange interference, low static punctuated by faint whispers. I chalked it up to wind noise, but Rachel wasn't buying it. This place is messing with our equipment, she muttered, smacking her camera. Why do I feel like we're in the setup for a bad horror movie? You're just nervous, I teased, though I felt it too. That sense of being watched, of something lurking just beyond sight. By sunset, the wind had picked up, and the dunes shimmered like molten gold. As we trekked deeper into the park, Jim pointed out landmarks, a cluster of bent trees, a dried-up creek bed, but everything started looking the same. Even the footprints we left seemed to vanish when we glanced back. Then came the first truly strange occurrence. Rachel froze mid-step and pointed. Do you see that? In the distance, a figure moved across the ridge. A man, or at least something man-shaped, silhouetted against the setting sun. It moved unnaturally, its limbs jerking like a marionette. I called out, but the figure didn't react. It turned abruptly and disappeared over the ridge. Jim's face went pale. We need to head back, now. What was that? Rachel asked. Not a person, Jim said, his voice trembling. It's the skinwalker. The hike back to camp was eerily quiet. The dunes absorbed sound, muffling our voices and even the crunch of our boots. The wind seemed to whisper, carrying fragments of speech that none of us were saying. I tried to break the tension by asking Jim about the skinwalker. It's from Navajo legend, he explained. A witch who can take the shape of animals or people. It mimics voices to lure you away. If it catches you... He trailed off, looking over his shoulder. The fading light painted deep shadows across his face. When we finally reached camp, it was nearly dark. We lit a fire, its flickering glow barely holding back the encroaching night. Rachel and I argued about what we'd seen. She was adamant it was a trick of the light, maybe a camper. Jim, on the other hand, was visibly shaken. Then we heard it, a voice calling my name. It came from the dunes, distant but distinct. My stomach dropped. Did you hear that? Rachel nodded, her face ashen. It's the wind, she said, but her voice wavered. The voice called again, closer this time. It was my name, but wrong somehow. Too smooth, too mechanical. Jim gripped my arm. Don't answer. Don't follow it. Why would I follow it? I snapped. But the voice kept calling. and with every repetition it sounded more like me. Sleep was impossible. The wind clawed at the tent, and every so often we heard footsteps circling the camp. When Rachel's camera began flashing by itself, she cursed and threw it into her bag. Around midnight, Jim broke. He confessed he'd found something earlier, a bone carved with symbols, and taken it as a souvenir. "It was just lying there," he said. "I didn't think—" Rachel exploded. "You brought a cursed object into camp? Are you insane?" Before we could stop him, Jim bolted into the dunes, muttering about returning the bone. His flashlight bobbed in the darkness until it vanished completely. We waited, calling his name, but he didn't come back. At dawn, we found Jim's flashlight half buried in the sand near a jagged ridge. There was no sign of him, but deep, inhuman footprints led away from the site. They were elongated, almost canine, but with too many toes. Rachel wanted to leave immediately. I agreed, but as we packed, we saw them again. Footprints circling the camp. Worse, they seemed to multiply the longer we looked. Then the figure returned. It stood atop a distant dune, silhouetted by the morning sun. This time it waved. We abandoned the camp, grabbing only what we could carry. The hike back was a nightmare. Our compasses spun uselessly, and every landmark looked wrong. Rachel kept snapping photos, hoping for proof, but none of the images came out. The figure followed us, always just out of reach, sometimes splitting into 2 or 3 forms before merging again. The whispers grew louder, overlapping voices calling our names. I saw Rachel flinch, covering her ears, but she kept moving. "Don't stop," she hissed. "Just keep moving." We reached the edge of the dunes by sheer luck, the parking lot coming into view like a mirage. But as we climbed to the final ridge, Rachel stopped dead. "What?" I asked. She turned to me, her face pale. "You're behind me, right?" My blood ran cold. I was standing 10 feet away. Rachel burned the bone we found that night. She said it was the only way to break the curse, though I'm not sure she believed it herself. Jim was never found. The rangers claimed he must have gotten lost, but we knew better. Even now, I hear the whispers sometimes. And Rachel, she's not the same. Sometimes she stares at nothing for hours, and when I ask if she's okay, she just smiles. A smile, too wide, too sharp, like it's not really hers. I've tried to convince myself it's all in my head, but deep down, I know the truth. Some places are meant to be left alone. Shaman's portal is one of them. My name is Jack Willis. I'm 35 years old, and this happened last October. At the time, I was traveling through Oklahoma in my RV, a little home on wheels I'd called Lone Star. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine, and it gave me the solitude I desperately needed after retiring from my job as a paramedic. I'd seen too much pain, too much death, and the open road felt like my only escape. That's how I found myself in the Wichita Mountains Wildlife Refuge, a rugged stretch of wilderness that seemed perfect for a few quiet nights. I parked in a secluded spot off a dirt trail, far from the main campground. It was peaceful. Just the sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional coyote howling in the distance. Exactly what I wanted. But that peace didn't last. The first night, I settled into my usual routine. A simple dinner cooked on a portable stove, followed by a cold beer under the stars. The sky was clear, the kind of black that swallows the world whole. I remember feeling small and insignificant out there, but in a way that was comforting. It was past midnight when I heard the whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind. The soft murmuring seemed to drift through the air, faint and unintelligible. I paused, beer in hand, and listened. The sound came again, low and insistent, like someone muttering just out of earshot. "Hello! I called out, my voice breaking the stillness. Nothing. Just the wind. I shook it off, telling myself it was my imagination. But even as I climbed into bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there, just beyond the firelight. The next morning, I decided to explore. The Wichita Mountains are famous for their rugged beauty, and I was eager to see more of the area. I hiked for hours, marveling at the towering rock formations and the herds of bison grazing in the distance. It felt good to stretch my legs, to breathe air that wasn't thick with the smell of antiseptic and blood. It was late afternoon when I found the cairn. I'd wandered off the marked trail, following a dry creek bed that wound through a narrow gorge. That's when I saw it, a pile of rocks, neatly stacked and unmistakably deliberate. The stones were weathered, their surfaces etched with strange, jagged carvings that didn't look natural. I frowned, stepping closer. Something about the cairn felt wrong. It wasn't just the carvings or the unnatural precision of the stack. It was the way the air seemed heavier around it, like the atmosphere itself was pressing down on me. Some local folklore, probably, I muttered to myself. I crouched down, examining one of the stones more closely. It was cool to the touch, almost icy despite the warm afternoon sun. Then I made my first mistake. I moved one of the stones. It wasn't intentional, I just wanted to see if there was anything beneath it. The moment I shifted the rock, a sharp gust of wind tore through the gorge, rattling the dry branches above me. The whispering sound came again, louder this time, and I swear it was coming from the cairn. I straightened, suddenly uneasy. The wind died as quickly as it had come, leaving the gorge unnervingly silent. I replaced the stone, but the damage was done. I could feel it. Something had changed. That night, the scratching started. I was lying in bed reading by the dim light of a battery-powered lantern when I heard it. A faint, rhythmic scraping against the outside of the RV. My first thought was an animal, a raccoon, maybe, but the sound was too deliberate, too steady. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The night was cold and eerily still, the moon casting long shadows across the campsite. I swept the flashlight beam over the RV but saw nothing. No tracks, no signs of wildlife. "Get a grip, Jack," I muttered, shaking my head. But as I turned to go back inside, I saw them. Claw-like scratches running down the side of the RV. The marks were shallow but unmistakable, as if something, or someone, had been dragging their nails along the metal. My stomach tightened. "Kids messing around," I said out loud, as if hearing my own voice would make it true. But deep down, I didn't believe it. The next morning, I found the recorder. It was half buried in the dirt near the edge of my campsite, an old tape recorder with a cracked plastic casing. Curious, I brushed off the dirt and pressed play. Static crackled through the tiny speaker, followed by a woman's voice. "If you found this," she began, her tone low and urgent, "then you've already seen the cairn." My breath caught. The voice continued, detailing a story eerily similar to mine. The woman, who identified herself as Martha, described finding the cairn, disturbing the stones, and the strange occurrences that followed. Her words grew more frantic as the recording went on. "It knows your fear," she whispered. "It feeds on it. Don't look at it. Don't listen to it. And whatever you do, don't make a deal." The tape ended abruptly, leaving me staring at the recorder in stunned silence. I wanted to believe it was some kind of elaborate hoax, but the scratches on my RV told a different story. That night, the entity revealed itself. I was sitting by the fire when I saw it, a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the trees. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs unnaturally long. Its eyes glowed like embers, burning into me from the darkness. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. Then, in a voice that sounded eerily like mine, it said, "You shouldn't have come." Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. I grabbed the tape recorder and hit play, listening to Martha's voice as she repeated her warnings. "Don't make a deal," she said again, her words like a lifeline. The figure stepped closer, its movements unnaturally smooth. I backed away, clutching the recorder like a talisman. The final confrontation came the next morning. Desperate to end the nightmare, I decided to return to the cairn. I packed a small bag with supplies and set off, the recorder tucked into my jacket. The hike felt longer this time, the landscape more twisted and surreal. The air was heavy with a sense of impending doom. When I reached the cairn, the entity was waiting. It loomed over the pile of rocks, its form more solid now, more menacing. Its eyes burned with a malevolent light. "You broke the seal," it said, its voice a guttural growl. "Now you owe a price." I dropped to my knees, pulling the recorder from my jacket. "I'm not making any deals," I said, my voice trembling. I hit play, letting Martha's voice fill the air. The entity recoiled, its form flickering like a flame in the wind. I grabbed the stone I'd moved and placed it back on the cairn. Then, remembering Martha's words, I began to chant her warnings out loud. The ground trembled beneath me, and the entity let out a bone-chilling roar. But as I finished the chant, the trembling stopped. The air grew still, and the shadowy figure dissolved into smoke. I left the Wichita Mountains that day, my body aching and my mind scarred. The scratches on my RV have faded, but I still see them in my nightmares. I know the entity isn't gone, just contained, waiting for the next fool to disturb its cairn. If you're reading this, take my advice. Leave the rocks alone. Some things are better left undisturbed. My name is Mia Patterson, and I'm 29 years old. This happened just a few months ago during the summer after my husband Derek and I got married. We were on a road trip through Oklahoma in our little RV, a second-hand beast we'd nicknamed Wanderer. It was meant to be our getaway vehicle, our escape from the grind of work and everyday stress. But what happened at Robbers Cave, well, it changed how I look at everything. We were parked in a remote campsite at Robbers Cave State Park, far from the other campers. Derek had insisted on the isolation. He wanted a real adventure, free from the noise of other people. I agreed at the time. I even thought it was romantic. Just the two of us in the wilderness. The first night, as the fire crackled low and the stars blazed overhead, Derek turned to me with that boyish grin I'd fallen in love with. "See, this is perfect," he said, leaning back in his camping chair. "Just us in the wild." I smiled and nodded, though the eerie quiet of the woods already had me on edge. The only sounds were the occasional chirp of crickets and the soft rustle of the wind in the trees. Then I heard it. A laugh. At first, I thought it was Derek, but his face didn't move. The sound was faint, almost like a child giggling, carried on the breeze. "Did you hear that?" I asked. "Hear what?" Derek looked at me confused. "Laughter." He shook his head, brushing it off. "Probably just an animal. Coyotes make weird noises sometimes." I let it go, but something about the sound lingered in my mind, setting me on edge. The next day, we explored the park, hiking one of the trails near our campsite. Robbers Cave is steeped in history, Derek had told me. Outlaws once hid there, and the rugged terrain gave it a mysterious reputation. I was fascinated by the stories, but as we hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. It started when we passed an old tree with strange carvings on its trunk. Symbols I couldn't identify, almost like runes. Derek joked about it, saying it was probably the work of bored teenagers. But I felt a chill crawl up my spine. By the time we returned to the RV, I was exhausted and on edge. Derek, of course, was his usual carefree self. "Come on, Mia," he said as he started a fire outside. "Don't let the spooky woods get to you." I tried to laugh it off, but that night, the laughter came again. It was closer this time, faint but unmistakable. A child's giggle, high-pitched and echoing through the trees. "Derek, tell me you heard that," I said, my voice shaking. He paused, his face serious for once. "Yeah, I heard it." We sat in silence, listening, but the laughter didn't come again. The third day, things took a darker turn. It started in the morning. I stepped out of the RV to find a small, dirt-covered handprint on the side of the vehicle. It was tiny, too small to belong to any adult. "Derek," I called, my voice trembling. "Come look at this." He frowned as he inspected the handprint. "Maybe a raccoon?" "Raccoons don't leave human handprints," I snapped. He shrugged, clearly trying to keep me calm. "Okay, so maybe a kid wandered by while we were sleeping. Let's not jump to conclusions." I didn't argue, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, the tapping began. It started as a faint knock on the RV window. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then it came again and again. "Derek, do you hear that?" He nodded, grabbing a flashlight. "Stay here." He stepped outside, sweeping the beam of light over the campsite. "Nothing out here," he called back. But as he turned to come back inside, I saw movement in the shadows. A small figure darting between the trees. "Derek, look!" I shouted. He turned, but the figure was gone. The boy appeared the next evening. We were sitting by the fire when he emerged from the woods. He looked no older than 10, his clothes tattered and his face smudged with dirt. "Are you okay?" Derek asked, rising to his feet. The boy nodded, his wide eyes locking onto mine. "I'm lost," he said in a small voice. "Where are your parents?" I asked. He didn't answer, just pointed into the woods. Something about him felt off. His movements were stiff, almost unnatural, and his eyes seemed too bright in the firelight. But he was a child, and I couldn't ignore that. "Do you want some food?" I offered, trying to sound gentle. The boy nodded again, but didn't step closer. He stayed near the edge of the firelight, watching us as Derek handed him a granola bar. "What's your name?" Derek asked. "Daniel," the boy replied, his voice flat and emotionless. "Daniel, where are you from?" He pointed into the woods again. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about the boy, about the way he'd stared at us without blinking. And then there were the dreams. I dreamed of running through the woods, the trees closing in around me. Something was chasing me, something I couldn't see but could feel. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. Derek had the same dream. "Do you think it's him?" I asked, my voice trembling. Derek didn't answer. When we stepped outside that morning, the symbols were back, drawn in soot this time, circling the RV. "We need to leave," I said, my voice firm. But Derek shook his head. "We can't just leave that kid out here. What if he's really lost?" Reluctantly, I agreed to search for him. We followed the trail he'd disappeared down, but the deeper we went, the more twisted and strange the forest became. The trees seemed to shift, their branches gnarled and reaching like skeletal hands. "Something's not right," I said, grabbing Derek's arm. Then we heard it. The laughter, louder now, surrounding us, and there he was. Daniel stood in the middle of the trail, his head cocked to one side, but he wasn't the same. His face was pale, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice echoing as if it came from everywhere at once. What happened next is a blur. Daniel, if that was even his name, began to change, his small frame stretching and twisting into something monstrous. He lunged at us, but Derek grabbed my hand and we ran. I don't know how long we ran, but eventually we stumbled onto the main trail and found our way back to the RV. I remembered a story I'd read about salt disrupting spirits, so I grabbed the shaker from our kitchen and poured a circle around the RV. Derek thought I was crazy, but I didn't care. For the rest of the night, we heard him outside scratching at the windows, whispering our names. But he never crossed the salt line. By dawn, the noises stopped. We packed up and left as fast as we could. When we reached the ranger station, we told them what had happened. They didn't believe us, of course, but one of them admitted that strange things had been reported in that area before. As we drove away, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw him standing at the edge of the woods, watching us. I still hear his laughter sometimes. And I still wonder if we really escaped, or if he's still out there, waiting for the next campers to wander too far into his woods. My name is Ethan Miller, and I was 42 when I decided to spend a weekend alone in Robbers Cave State Park. It was a decision born out of desperation, a need to escape the suffocating reminders of my failed marriage and the empty house I'd been living in for the past 6 months. I thought a camping trip would help me clear my head. What I found instead was something I still can't fully explain. It was late spring, warm enough for camping, but early enough in the season to avoid the summer crowds. I drove my RV into the park on a Friday morning, eager for some peace and quiet. Robbers Cave had always fascinated me. The idea of exploring a place once used as a hideout by outlaws felt like the perfect way to distract myself. Plus, I'd heard the views were incredible. I parked in a secluded spot near the edge of the forest, far enough from the main campground to feel like I was really getting away from it all. The first day was uneventful. I hiked a couple of trails, took some photos of the cliffs and rock formations, and even managed to enjoy the solitude. That night, as I sat by the campfire with a mug of coffee, I almost felt at peace. The next morning, I decided to explore the caves themselves. That's where everything started to go wrong. The trail to the caves was rugged and poorly marked, but I didn't mind. It added to the sense of adventure. As I approached the entrance to one of the smaller caves, I noticed something odd. A rusted tin soldier lying in the dirt. It looked ancient, the kind of toy that might have belonged to a child a century ago. "Strange place for this," I muttered, picking it up. The metal felt icy cold against my skin, and for a moment I thought I heard faint laughter echoing from the cave. I shook it off, assuming it was just my imagination. Still, the toy unsettled me, so I left it where I'd found it and continued on. Inside the cave, the air was cool and damp. The walls were rough and uneven, carved by time and water. As I moved deeper into the darkness, I noticed a series of carvings etched into the stone. They were crude but detailed, depicting what looked like children holding hands in a circle. Above them loomed a horned figure, its face twisted into a sinister grin. I took a photo, feeling a chill run down my spine. The deeper I went, the darker it became, until the beam of my flashlight was the only thing keeping the shadows at bay. That's when I heard it again. The laughter. It was faint at first, almost like the sound of wind moving through the cave. But as I stood there, holding my breath, it grew louder and clearer. It wasn't happy laughter. It was high-pitched and strained. like the sound of children playing a game they didn't want to be part of. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing off the walls. The laughter stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so complete it made my ears ring. I turned to leave, but as I did, I caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye, a pale figure darting through the shadows. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw a child standing just beyond its beam. "Hey!" I shouted, more out of instinct than anything else. But when I stepped closer, there was no one there, just the empty cave. By the time I made it back to the RV, my hands were shaking. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, just the tricks of a tired mind in a dark cave. But when I opened the door to the RV, I froze. There were handprints on the windows. Small, child-sized handprints smeared in dirt. Maybe some kids wandered through, I told myself. Though I knew it wasn't true. I'd seen no one else on the trail, and the prints hadn't been there that morning. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the laughter again, faint but persistent. Around midnight, I decided I'd had enough. I packed my gear, intending to leave at first light. But as I sat in the driver's seat waiting for the sun to rise, something slammed against the side of the RV. The entire vehicle shook, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. Grabbing a flashlight, I stepped outside to investigate. The forest was silent, the kind of silence that presses down on you like a weight. I swept the beam of light across the clearing, and that's when I saw them. 3 children stood at the edge of the forest, barely visible in the dim light. They wore old-fashioned clothing, their faces pale and expressionless. One of them was holding the tin soldier I'd found earlier. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "What do you want?" They didn't answer. Instead, they turned and walked into the trees, disappearing into the shadows. Against every instinct, I followed them. I don't know why. I just felt like I had to. The children led me back to the cave, their pale figures barely visible in the moonlight. When I reached the entrance, they were gone. But the laughter started again, louder this time, echoing all around me. I stepped inside, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The carvings on the walls seemed to glow faintly, and the air was so cold I could see my breath. As I moved deeper into the cave, I saw them again. The children. They were standing in a circle, their hands clasped together, their faces turned toward me. "Please," one of them said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Help us." Before I could respond, the ground beneath me seemed to shift, and I fell to my knees. The air grew heavier, pressing down on me like a physical force. That's when I saw it. A shadow emerged from the darkness, its form shifting and amorphous. It was the horned figure from the carvings, its eyes glowing red and its presence radiating malice. The children scattered, their forms flickering like candles in the wind. The shadow moved closer, its voice a low guttural growl. "You shouldn't have come here." I scrambled backward, my heart pounding. In my panic, I grabbed the tin soldier from my pocket. It must have fallen in when I'd picked it up earlier. Without thinking, I hurled it at the shadow. To my surprise, the figure recoiled, its form flickering like a broken image. Seizing the moment, I grabbed a rock and smashed the toy to pieces. The shadow let out an ear-splitting roar before dissolving into the darkness. The children reappeared, their expressions softer now, almost peaceful. "Thank you," the girl said, her voice filled with relief. Then they faded away, leaving me alone in the cave. When I finally made it back to the RV, the sun was rising. Exhausted and shaken, I drove away without looking back. I don't know what I encountered in that cave, but I know it wasn't just a legend. Some places are haunted, not by ghosts, but by the weight of what's happened there. And some stories are better left untold. My name is Sophia Klein, and I was 34 when I took what should have been an ordinary work trip to Red Rock Canyon. As a travel blogger, my life revolves around uncovering hidden gems and sharing them with the world. It's not always glamorous, but it's a dream I left a stable desk job for, and I've worked hard to make it pay off. That's why, when another blogger tipped me off about an abandoned homestead deep in the canyon, I jumped at the chance to document it. Little did I know that decision would change everything. It was late October, the air cool, but the days still warm enough to make hiking bearable. Red Rock Canyon, with its burnt orange cliffs and winding trails, had been on my list for months. I drove my RV into the park and parked at one of the more isolated sites near the backcountry trails. I wanted solitude, not just for the photos, but because I worked best without distractions. The first day was uneventful. I hiked the main trails, snapping pictures of the dramatic rock formations and the golden light of the setting sun. That night, I settled into the RV, reviewing the day's shots on my laptop. I told myself I'd tackle the homestead the next day. It was supposed to be off the beaten path, accessible only by an unmarked trail. The blogger who'd told me about it had been cryptic, claiming it was haunted, and not a place locals like to talk about. I'd laughed it off at the time. Ghost stories were good for clicks. The next morning, I loaded my gear into my backpack: camera, tripod, GPS, water, snacks, and a small bundle of sage I'd brought as a prop for some atmospheric photos. The park ranger, Jimmy Monroe, caught me at the trailhead. "Headed somewhere specific?" he asked, his grizzled face shaded under a wide-brimmed hat. "Just exploring," I said, keeping it vague. I didn't want to explain my plan to someone who might try to dissuade me. Jimmy squinted at me, his gray eyes sharp. "Stay on the marked trails, Miss Klein. People get lost out here. In some places you're better off leaving alone." "I'll be careful," I promised. The unmarked trail was harder to find than I'd expected. It wasn't on any of the maps I'd downloaded, but I'd been given a rough idea of where to look. After an hour of searching, I finally spotted a faint path cutting through the brush. The trail was narrow and overgrown, winding through a dense grove of trees that blocked out the sun. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest became. The cheerful chirping of birds and rustling of leaves faded, replaced by an oppressive silence. I stopped to check my GPS and found the screen blank. The battery had inexplicably died, even though I'd charged it that morning. "Great," I muttered, tucking it back into my pack. I pressed on, keeping an eye on the trail and marking my path with small stones so I could find my way back. About a mile in, I noticed something odd. A circle of animal bones arranged in the dirt. They were clean and white, as though bleached by the sun, but the way they were placed, neatly aligned, forming a perfect ring, sent a shiver down my spine. "This'll make a creepy photo," I said aloud, trying to shake off the unease. I snapped a few pictures and moved on, but the sense of being watched was impossible to ignore. Every so often, I glanced over my shoulder, convinced I'd catch someone, or something, following me. There was never anything there. By the time I reached the homestead, the sun was dipping low on the horizon, bathing the clearing in golden light. The house was a ruin. Sagging walls, shattered windows, and a roof half collapsed under the weight of time. Vines snaked through the gaps in the wood, and the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. Inside, the temperature dropped sharply. My breath fogged as I stepped through the doorway. The interior was a mess of broken furniture and scattered debris. On one wall, someone had carved strange symbols, circles, triangles, and jagged lines that looked almost like runes. Creepy, I whispered, snapping a picture. In the fireplace sat a rusted cauldron filled with animal bones and ash. I leaned in for a closer look and felt a sudden gust of icy wind whip through the room, extinguishing the last of the daylight. The hair on my arms stood on end, and I could have sworn I heard a faint whisper, just on the edge of hearing. "Sophia," it said. I spun around, my heart hammering. There was no one there. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. Silence. I told myself it was my imagination, a trick of the mind in an unfamiliar place. But as I set up my tripod, the whisper came again, clearer this time. "Sophia, help me." It was a child's voice, plaintive and soft. I froze, my hands shaking. "Who's there?" I demanded. But the words barely made it past my lips. The shadows in the room seemed to lengthen, twisting unnaturally. I grabbed my flashlight and swung the beam across the room. In the far corner, I saw her. She was pale, almost translucent, with long tangled hair and hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. Her mouth moved, but the words didn't match the movements. "Sophia," she said again, her voice layered as though multiple people were speaking at once. "Why did you come here?" I stumbled backward, tripping over debris. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for my matches. When I struck one, the tiny flame illuminated the figure standing inches from me. Her face was gaunt, her lips stretched into a sinister smile. "You don't belong here," she hissed, her voice echoing in my head. I screamed, dropping the match. In my panic, I remembered the sage in my pack. My hands shook as I lit the bundle, holding it out like a shield. The smoke filled the room, and the figure recoiled, her form flickering like a candle in the wind. "Leave," she whispered, her voice full of venom. I didn't need to be told twice. Clutching the burning sage, I bolted from the house, crashing through the underbrush in my desperation to escape. The forest seemed alive, the trees closing in around me, branches clawing at my arms and legs. By the time I reached the main trail, I was gasping for breath, my clothes torn and my heart pounding. I didn't stop running until I reached the safety of my RV. That night, I locked every door and window, but sleep didn't come. The air inside the RV felt heavy, and faint whispers drifted through the stillness. When dawn finally broke, I packed up and left without looking back. Back home, I reviewed the photos I'd taken. Most were normal, if eerie, but one sent a chill down my spine. In the corner of the frame, barely visible in the shadows, was the pale figure of the witch, her hollow eyes staring straight at me. Even now, I can't explain what I saw. All I know is that some places are better left undiscovered, and some stories are better left untold. My name is Emily Mercer, and I was 16 years old when my family and I went on the camping trip that changed everything. It happened in the heart of the Wichita National Forest, deep in Oklahoma, in the kind of place where the trees are so thick they block out the sun and time seems to stand still. We thought it would be a nice break from our busy lives, a chance to reconnect. But what we found out there in the woods was something none of us were prepared for. It started as my dad's idea. "We need this," he said. My dad, Dave, was 45 at the time, an engineer who spent more time working than he did with us. He wanted to make it up to my mom, Sarah, and my little brother, Jake, who was 12 and practically glued to his gaming console. I wasn't exactly thrilled about the trip either, but I figured I could at least get some good photos for my portfolio. We drove our RV into the forest on a Friday evening. The campsite my dad picked was remote, a little clearing surrounded by towering pines. "No distractions," he said, like it was a badge of honor. But honestly, it just felt isolating. The nearest ranger station was miles away, and the only sounds were the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional chirp of a bird. For a while, it was peaceful. The first sign that something wasn't right came that evening, just after we'd set up camp. Jake and I were collecting firewood when we noticed how quiet it had gotten. The usual hum of insects and birds had disappeared, leaving an eerie, heavy silence. "You hear that?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't hear anything," I replied. And that was the problem. It was unnatural, like the forest was holding its breath. We didn't say much as we hurried back to the RV. Dinner was uneventful, though the quietness of the woods gnawed at the back of my mind. My mom tried to lighten the mood with her usual optimism, but I could tell even she was uneasy. That night, as I lay in my bunk, I started hearing strange sounds outside. At first, it was just a faint rustling, like an animal moving through the underbrush. But then it got louder, heavy footsteps crunching on the gravel near the RV. I froze, listening. It didn't sound like a deer or any other animal I'd heard before. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and then they stopped, right outside my window. "Dad," I whispered, shaking him awake. "What is it?" he groaned, still half asleep. "Something's outside," I said. He grabbed a flashlight and stepped out, but when he shined the beam into the woods, there was nothing there. "Probably just a raccoon," he said, brushing it off. But I saw the way his hand lingered on the RV door handle, the way his eyes darted toward the dark tree line. He was just as unsettled as I was. The next morning, things got worse. Jake and I found strange tracks near the edge of the campsite. They were large, almost human, but with long, claw-like toes. Jake joked that it must be Bigfoot, but his voice was shaky, and I knew he didn't really believe it. When we showed the tracks to my dad, he frowned. "Looks like a bear," he said, but his tone wasn't convincing. Still, he insisted we stick to our plans for a hike. "It's the wilderness," he said. "We're bound to see weird things." The hike was uneventful at first, but as we ventured deeper into the forest, that eerie silence returned. Even Jake, who usually complained about everything, stayed quiet. Then we started noticing the smell, a rancid, decaying odor that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. My mom gagged, pulling her scarf over her nose. "I think we should head back," she said. "Let's just get to the overlook," Dad replied. "It's not far." Reluctantly, we pressed on, but the smell only got worse. By the time we reached the overlook, the air was thick with it, and I couldn't help but feel like we were being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. That evening, as the rain started, we huddled in the RV, trying to make the best of it. Jake and I played cards while my mom cooked dinner. Dad tinkered with the generator, which had been acting up all day. But then, as the rain pattered against the windows, I heard it again. Footsteps. This time, they were accompanied by something else. A voice. "Emily," it called, faint and distant. "Emily, come here." I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. It was my mom's voice, but she was standing right next to me. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Hear what?" my mom replied. But then Jake spoke up. "I heard it too," he said, his face pale. Dad grabbed his flashlight again and stepped outside, but I begged him not to go. "It's not safe," I said. "Stay here," he said firmly. "I'll be right back." He didn't go far, just around the RV, but when he came back, his face was grim. "There's nothing out there," he said, but his eyes told a different story. That night, none of us slept. The smell was back, stronger than ever, seeping into the RV. And the footsteps didn't stop. They circled the RV, slow and deliberate, for hours. We huddled together, too scared to move. By dawn, we were ready to leave, but when my dad tried to start the RV, it wouldn't budge. "The storm must have knocked something loose," he muttered, but I could hear the panic in his voice. We decided to hike back to the ranger station, but as we packed up, I noticed something on the ground, a piece of Jake's jacket. It was shredded, as if by claws, and covered in mud. "How did this happen?" I asked, but no one had an answer. As we made our way through the forest, the feeling of being watched never left us. The shadows seemed to move, and every now and then I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye. A gaunt, skeletal figure with glowing eyes and antlers. "Keep moving," Dad said, his voice tight. But then it started again. The voices. They mimicked each of us, calling out from the woods. "Dave," one voice said, "over here." "Sarah," another called, "help me." We tried to ignore them, but they were relentless, growing louder and more insistent. The figure was closer now, weaving through the trees like a nightmare come to life. It moved unnaturally, its limbs too long, its steps too silent. We ran. My dad tried to lead us back to the RV, but the creature was faster. It appeared in front of us, its hollow eyes staring straight at me. I froze, paralyzed by fear, but my dad grabbed my arm and pulled me away. "Keep going," he shouted. Back at the RV, we barricaded ourselves inside. My dad fashioned makeshift weapons, knives, a hatchet, anything we could find. My mom remembered reading about native rituals in a park guidebook and used ash from the campfire to draw protective symbols on the doors and windows. When the creature attacked, it was like nothing I'd ever seen. It slammed against the RV, shattering windows and clawing at the doors. My dad fought it off with the hatchet, but it was relentless, its glowing eyes burning with rage. My mom lit a lantern and threw it at the creature, dousing it in flames. It let out a bone-chilling scream as it burned, a sound that still haunts my nightmares. By dawn, it was over. The creature was gone, but the forest was silent again, as if mourning its loss. We were found by a park ranger later that day who escorted us out of the forest. When we told him what had happened, he didn't seem surprised. "You're lucky you got out," he said. "Most don't." We never went camping again. Sometimes I still look at the photos I took that weekend, and in some of them I see it. The glowing eyes, the antlers, the shadow lurking just beyond the trees. It's a reminder that some places aren't meant to be explored, and some things are better left undisturbed. My name is Matt Grayson, and I'm 41 years old. I've spent most of my life behind a camera lens, capturing the world's beauty one frame at a time. Photography has always been my escape, my way of making sense of the chaos around me. But what happened last fall in Black Kettle grasslands in Oklahoma, that's something I can't explain, no matter how many pictures I take. It started as a work trip. I was scouting locations for a new photography book about America's wild landscapes. Black Kettle is one of those hidden gems, a sprawling expanse of rolling prairie, rugged trails, and solitude. It's not the kind of place most tourists flock to, which made it perfect for my project. I also needed the quiet. Ever since losing my fiancée 2 years ago, I've found it harder and harder to be around people. Being alone in nature felt like the reset button I needed. I pulled my RV into a clearing near a cluster of cottonwood trees, miles from the nearest trailhead. The late afternoon sun painted the grasslands in gold and amber, the kind of light that makes photographers giddy. I set up my cameras and motion sensors, eager to capture the nocturnal wildlife I knew roamed the area. Just as I was finishing, a park ranger drove up in an old Jeep. She got out, a no-nonsense woman in her late 30s with the name E. Harker stitched on her uniform. You planning to camp here? She asked, eyeing my RV. Yeah, why? I replied. Just be careful, she said. This area has a reputation. Locals call it Cursed Prairie. Strange things happen out here. I couldn't help but laugh. What kind of strange things? She hesitated. Wailing sounds, things moving on their own, people getting lost even though they know the trails. Most folks stay clear of this part. Well, I'm not most folks, I said, grinning. Don't worry, I'll be fine. She didn't smile back. Suit yourself, she said, climbing back into her Jeep. Just don't wander too far after dark. Her words lingered as the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the prairie bathed in shadows. But I brushed them off. Superstition wasn't my thing. The first sign of something wrong came just after midnight. I was reviewing some shots on my laptop when I heard it, a faint, mournful wail drifting on the wind. At first, I thought it was an animal. Coyotes, maybe. But the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, more human. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the horizon. The prairie stretched endlessly in every direction, a sea of rippling grass under the moonlight. Hello? I called, my voice swallowed by the emptiness. The wailing stopped, leaving only the whisper of the wind. I told myself it was nothing, just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. But I locked the RV door before going back inside. The next morning, I found my motion sensor cameras had been moved. They were all pointed toward a barren patch of earth about 50 yards from the RV. I hadn't touched them since setting them up. When I checked the footage, the memory cards were empty, just static and faint distortions. I tried to brush it off as a technical glitch, but the unease in my gut was harder to ignore. Later that day, while hiking to scout more locations, I found something unsettling. Handprints, large, misshapen, and pressed into the dirt near the barren patch where the cameras had pointed. They were too big to be human and too defined to be an animal. I returned to the RV with a sense of dread I couldn't shake. That night, the wailing returned, louder this time. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, determined to find the source. The air was colder than it should have been for October, and the prairie felt unnaturally still. As I swept the beam of light across the landscape, I saw it, a shadowy figure standing near the barren patch. It was tall, vaguely feminine, with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce the darkness. My breath caught in my throat. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. Then, slowly, it began to drift toward me, its movements unnatural, as if it were gliding just above the ground. I stumbled back into the RV, slamming the door shut and locking it. The figure stopped just outside the window, its glowing eyes fixed on me. Then it vanished. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I drove to the ranger station and found Evelyn Harker. I told her what I'd seen, half expecting her to laugh or dismiss me. Instead, she nodded gravely. "You saw her," she said. "The weeping woman." She explained that the land was cursed, tied to a massacre that happened here in the 1800s. Settlers had attacked an indigenous village, killing everyone, including women and children. Legend says one of the mothers cursed the land before she died, vowing to make it uninhabitable for anyone who disrespected it. "Some people say the weeping woman is her spirit," Evelyn said. "Others think she's a manifestation of all the lives lost here." "Why would she come after me?" I asked. "Because you're here," she said simply, "and because you don't believe." I should have left, but I didn't. I told myself I needed one last shot, one last chance to document the prairie under the stars. Maybe I was just being stubborn. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that none of this was real. That night, the wailing came again, louder and more anguished than ever. I stepped outside, clutching my camera like a talisman. The air was heavy, electric, as if the prairie itself was holding its breath. The weeping woman appeared near the barren patch, her shadowy form clearer now. She wasn't just a shadow. She was something more solid, more real. Her glowing eyes locked onto mine, and her voice, soft, sorrowful, and accusing, cut through the night. You let her die. For a moment, I thought she meant my fiancé. Guilt flooded me, memories of the accident that took her life crashing over me like a wave. I dropped to my knees, trembling. "I'm sorry," I whispered, though I wasn't sure who I was apologizing to. She drifted closer, her presence suffocating. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. In desperation, I remembered Evelyn's words about honoring the dead. I pulled my camera from around my neck, my most prized possession, and placed it on the ground. "This is all I have," I said, my voice shaking. "I'm sorry." The weeping woman paused, her glowing eyes dimming. Slowly, she reached out and touched the camera. Then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. The air felt lighter, the prairie alive again with the sounds of insects and rustling grass. I left Black Kettle grasslands at dawn, vowing never to return. But the experience stayed with me. Weeks later, when I developed the photos from that night, I found one that wasn't mine, a perfectly clear image of the weeping woman, standing alone in the grass watching me. Somewhere in those empty plains, her sorrow lingers, and so does the curse. My name is Angela Reynolds, but most people call me Angie. I'm 34 years old and I work as a freelance photojournalist. Last fall, I took an assignment to document the hidden beauty of Chickasaw National Recreation Area, focusing on Arbuckle Lake. I didn't know then how much that trip would change me, or how close I'd come to losing myself in the process. It was late October, the time of year when the air turns crisp and the leaves light up in hues of gold and red. I drove my old RV to a secluded spot near Arbuckle Lake's western shore. I had 3 days to capture sunrise and sunset shots, hike the trails, and immerse myself in the serenity of nature. Honestly, I needed this trip more than I let on. My creativity had been drying up, and deadlines were beginning to loom like storm clouds. It wasn't all weighing on me. My sister, Mia, and I hadn't spoken in over a year. We used to be close, but after a bitter argument about family obligations, we drifted apart. I told myself this trip was about work, but I knew I was really trying to run from that guilt. I pulled into a quiet cove away from the more popular campsites. The air was still, almost too still, and the lake mirrored the sky so perfectly it felt surreal. As I set up my tripod near the water's edge, an older man in a ranger uniform approached. His badge read Dave Carter. "Beautiful spot," he said, his voice friendly but carrying a hint of caution. "But I wouldn't camp here if I were you." "Why not?" I asked, curious. "Locals call it Drowning Cove," he said. "Lots of stories about bad energy here, people hearing voices, seeing things. Most folks avoid it." I laughed nervously. "Well, I'm here for the photos, not the ghost stories." He nodded, but didn't seem convinced. "Just be careful. Don't wander too close to the water at night." With that, he left, and I pushed his warning out of my mind. The light was perfect, and I spent hours photographing the fiery colors of sunset over the lake. By the time I returned to the RV, darkness had settled, and the air carried a chill that seemed sharper than the season warranted. The next morning, I woke early to catch the sunrise. As I set up my drone to get aerial shots of the cove, it refused to power on. It had worked fine the day before. Frustrated, I switched to my DSLR camera, only to find its battery mysteriously drained. I'd charged it overnight. I resorted to using my backup camera, which seemed to work, at least for now. Still, something about the lake felt different that morning. It was eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, not even the distant hum of insects, just an oppressive, suffocating stillness. After breakfast, I decided to explore the shoreline on foot. That's when I found the locket. It was half buried in the mud. A small, tarnished thing with a heart-shaped charm. Inside was a faded photo of a young girl, maybe 9 or 10 years old, with curly hair and a solemn expression. The photo looked old, its edges frayed and discolored. I glanced around, feeling a sudden prickling on the back of my neck. I slipped the locket into my pocket, thinking I'd turn it into the ranger station later. That night, things escalated. I was reviewing the day's photos when I heard it. A faint splashing sound like someone wading into the lake. I froze, my heart hammering. Slowly, I stood and peered out the RV window. The water was still, no ripples, no movement, just the glassy surface of the lake reflecting the crescent moon. Then came the voice. "Come play with me." It was faint, but unmistakable. A child's voice, carried on the wind. My chest tightened. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the shoreline. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. "Is someone there?" The light revealed nothing but empty water and rocks. I told myself it was just my imagination, went back inside and locked the door. But I barely slept that night, the voice echoing in my mind. The next morning, I found wet footprints inside the RV. They were small, like a child's, and trailed from the door to my bed before disappearing. My stomach churned. I checked the door. It was still locked from the inside. There was no way anyone could have entered. I wanted to leave, but something held me back. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe pride, or maybe it was the ghostly presence that seemed to root me in place. By afternoon, I couldn't ignore the pull of the locket. I walked to the edge of the lake and stared into its depths. The water was impossibly clear, revealing smooth stones and the occasional flicker of fish. But as I stood there, a shadow moved beneath the surface. It looked like a child. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The shadow swirled and vanished, leaving the water still again. I was losing my mind, or so I thought. That night, I dreamed of her. She was standing in the water, her wet hair clinging to her face, her dark eyes staring at me. "You left me," she said, her voice hollow and accusatory. I woke with a start, drenched in sweat. My shoes were soaked, even though I hadn't left the RV. By the time darkness fell on my third night, I was unraveling. I stood at the shoreline, clutching the locket, determined to face whatever haunted this place. "What do you want from me?" I shouted into the empty night. The water rippled. Slowly, a figure rose from the lake, a pale, translucent girl with hollow eyes and a tattered summer dress. She pointed at the locket in my hand. "You found it," she said, her voice soft but cold. "Come closer." My feet moved on their own, wading into the freezing water. It felt like needles stabbing my skin, but I couldn't stop. She beckoned me deeper, her expression shifting from sorrow to something darker, something hungry. "You left me," she repeated, her voice growing harsher. The water churned around us and her hands reached out, claw-like and grasping. I screamed and fought to break free, my thoughts consumed by guilt. In that moment, Mia's face flashed in my mind. Her laughter, her tears, all the years we'd spent as sisters before I let my pride ruin everything. "I'm sorry," I whispered. tears streaming down my face. "I'm sorry, Mia." The ghost froze. Her grip loosened and her expression softened. For a moment, she looked like a normal, scared little girl. Then she dissolved into the water, leaving the lake still once more. At dawn, I packed up and left. The locket was gone, and so was the heavy feeling in the air. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. At the edge of the cove stood a small figure waving. When I got home, the first thing I did was call Mia. We talked for hours, and for the first time in years, I felt like I had my sister back. I never wrote about what happened at Arbuckle Lake. Some stories are too personal to share, but I'll never forget the ghost of that little girl, or the lessons she taught me about guilt, forgiveness, and the ties that bind us, even beyond the grave. My name is Elliot Harper, and I'm 29 years old. What I'm about to share happened in the summer of last year, deep in the Wichita Mountains in Oklahoma. I had gone there alone, looking for inspiration for my novel. I needed a break from city life, from the constant buzz of people and deadlines, and I thought the solitude of the wilderness would clear my head. What I found instead was something I still can't fully explain. It was supposed to be a week of peace and quiet, camping along the trails near the Talamena Scenic Drive. I'd packed everything carefully: tent, stove, sleeping bag, GPS, food, the works. My sister Claire had begged me not to go alone, but I waved her off. "It's just camping," I'd said. "I'll be fine." She didn't understand my need to be alone. Neither did my friend Tyler, who had spent years obsessing over survivalist hobbies. Before I left, he told me, "Watch out for the local legends. Skinwalkers, man, they're no joke." I laughed it off at the time. It felt ridiculous, but Tyler's warning stuck in my head like a splinter I couldn't remove. The first day of my trip went smoothly. I hiked into the forest, following a trail that led me away from the more popular campsites. The further I went, the quieter it became. The only sounds were the rustling leaves and the occasional bird call. It was exactly what I needed. By the time I set up my tent and made dinner, I felt more relaxed than I had in months. But that night things started to feel off. It began with the sounds. At first, I thought they were coyotes, their yipping calls echoing through the trees. But as I lay in my tent, the sounds grew stranger. Some of them almost sounded like voices, faint, high-pitched, and eerily human. I told myself I was imagining things. The forest was full of strange noises at night, right? The next morning, I found my food supply scattered outside the tent. A raccoon, I figured. But as I packed up to move to another site, I noticed something odd. There were no tracks leading to or from the tent, just my own boot prints. The second night, I camped near a small stream, far off the main trail. I spent the evening jotting down notes for my novel, feeling more productive than I had in weeks. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest grew darker and quieter than I thought possible. The moonlight barely filtered through the dense canopy of trees. That's when I saw the tracks. At first, they looked like deer prints, scattered along the muddy bank of the stream. But as I followed them, they changed. The hoof marks became elongated, more like a human foot, bare, with long toes. I stopped dead in my tracks, a cold chill running through me. Something about them wasn't right. They were too deep, as if whatever made them weighed far more than it should. I told myself it was just some kind of animal I didn't recognize. But deep down, I knew better. That night, I heard the whispers. They came from outside my tent, faint and fragmented, like someone was speaking just out of earshot. "Elliot," they said. My name. It was my sister's voice, clear as day. "Hello?" I called out, my heart pounding. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, shining the beam into the darkness. Nothing. Just the trees, swaying gently in the night breeze. But the whispering continued, circling my campsite. I didn't sleep that night. The third day, I decided to cut my trip short. The forest no longer felt peaceful. It felt like it was watching me. My GPS had stopped working and my backup compass seemed unreliable, its needle spinning erratically. I managed to find a faint trail and followed it, hoping it would lead me back toward the road. That evening, as the sun set, I stumbled upon a clearing. In the center stood a large deer, perfectly still. Its antlers were massive, almost too large for its body. It didn't move as I approached, didn't even flinch when I clapped my hands. Its eyes, though, they were wrong, too human. I backed away slowly, and that's when it screamed. A long, high-pitched wail that sounded like a woman in agony. My stomach churned as the deer bolted into the trees, its cries echoing long after it was gone. By the time I made camp, I was trembling. I built a fire, hoping it would keep whatever was out there at bay. That's when I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the firelight. It was tall and human-shaped, but its proportions were all wrong. Arms too long, head tilted unnaturally to one side. "Who's there?" I shouted, gripping a burning branch like a weapon. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, watching. Then, slowly, it raised a hand and pointed at me. My blood turned to ice. The fire crackled, and in an instant, the figure was gone. I barely slept. Every rustle of the leaves, every snap of a twig, sent my heart racing. When dawn finally came, I packed up and started walking. Faster this time. I didn't care where the trail led as long as it got me out of the forest. But the forest wasn't done with me. That evening, as I trudged up a rocky incline, the thing appeared again. This time, it stepped out from behind a tree, fully visible in the fading light. It looked like me. Same height, same build, same clothes. But its face was wrong. The features were smudged, like a blurred photo, and its eyes were black pits. It spoke, and the voice was my own. "Stay," it said, tilting its head like a curious animal. I ran. I didn't care about the trail anymore, didn't care if I got lost. I just ran, branches whipping against my face, my lungs burning. The thing chased me, its footsteps pounding the ground behind me. I could hear it mimicking my voice, laughing, crying, screaming. Finally, I burst onto a gravel road, collapsing to my knees. A pickup truck screeched to a stop, and the driver, a middle-aged man with a thick southern accent, jumped out. "You okay, son?" he asked. I tried to explain, but the words came out in broken fragments. He must have thought I was crazy, but he helped me into the truck and drove me back to town. I looked back once, just before we turned a corner, and I swear I saw it standing at the edge of the forest, watching me leave. I thought it was over. But a few days later, back in my apartment, I found muddy hoof prints on my balcony. Now I sleep with the lights on. My name is Marcus Reed, and I was 41 years old when this happened. I've spent years on the road, traveling in my RV, exploring every inch of America's wilderness. It started as an escape from grief after I lost my wife, Sarah, 5 years ago. Now, it's a way to keep moving, to avoid sinking too deep into memories that hurt more than they heal. This story takes place in the Wichita National Forest, Oklahoma. It was supposed to be just another stop on my journey, a place to hike, take photos, and write for my nature blog. But what happened in those woods is something I'll never forget, something I don't think I'll ever fully understand. I arrived late one afternoon, parking my RV in a secluded spot off a dirt road. The Wichita National Forest was as peaceful as I'd imagined, tall pines stretching to the sky. their needles carpeting the ground in a soft rust-colored blanket. The air was crisp, and the only sounds were the distant chirping of birds and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. It felt like the kind of place where you could breathe deeply and let the weight of the world slide off your shoulders. The first sign of trouble came as I was setting up camp. The RV's water pump, which had worked fine that morning, decided to quit on me. I tried everything I could think of, but it refused to work. I'd have to ration my bottled water until I could fix it. Not a big deal, I muttered, trying to convince myself. But something about the silence around me felt heavy. The next morning, I set out on a hike, camera in hand, eager to capture the beauty of the forest. About an hour in, I came across something strange. A small, ornate wooden box partially buried under the roots of a tree. Its surface was carved with intricate patterns, symbols I didn't recognize, and it was locked with a rusted latch. My first instinct was to leave it alone, but curiosity got the better of me. I dug it out and turned it over in my hands. The carvings felt old, ancient, and there was a faint chill to the wood despite the warmth of the day. I decided to bring it back to the RV, thinking it might make an interesting story for the blog. That night, as I sat by the fire editing photos, I heard it, a soft tapping sound on the RV's roof. At first, I thought it was a branch swaying in the wind, but the tapping moved, circling the RV. It wasn't random, it was deliberate. Probably an animal, I told myself, though the hair on the back of my neck prickled. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped outside. The night was pitch black, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the shadows. But there was nothing there. Just the trees, tall and unmoving, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. When I returned to the RV, I found the box sitting on the counter. Open. I knew I hadn't touched it since bringing it in. Inside was a small, cracked mirror and a bundle of dried flowers tied with black string. The sight of it sent a chill through me, though I couldn't explain why. The mirror's surface was dark, almost oily, and my reflection in it seemed wrong. It stared back at me with an intensity that didn't match my expression. I snapped the box shut and shoved it into a cupboard. I didn't sleep well that night. The next day, my hike felt different. The forest seemed darker, the air heavier. As I walked, I noticed fleeting shadows at the edge of my vision, humanoid shapes that disappeared the moment I turned to look. My footsteps felt too loud, as if the forest were holding its breath, waiting. That night, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, like wind through the trees, but as I lay in bed, they grew louder, forming words just on the edge of comprehension. And then I heard her voice. Marcus. It was Sarah, my wife's voice, clear and unmistakable, calling my name. I bolted upright, my heart pounding. Sarah? I called out, even though I knew it wasn't possible. The whispers stopped, replaced by silence so deep it felt alive. Over the next few days, the whispers became relentless. They spoke to me in Sarah's voice, begging, pleading. Help me, Marcus. I'm here, don't leave me. I tried to convince myself it wasn't real, but the whispers knew things only Sarah would have known. They reminded me of the promises we'd made, the life we'd shared. They dredged up every ounce of guilt I carried over her death. I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, she was trapped here, waiting for me to save her. The box became the focus of it all. Whenever I tried to move it, the whispers grew louder. The mirror inside seemed to pulse with a dark light, and my reflection in it became more distorted, more malicious. One night, I woke to the sound of the RV shaking violently. Shadows filled the room, their forms twisting and writhing like smoke. They pressed against the walls, the windows, their whispers now a cacophony of voices. "You opened the box," they hissed. "You freed us." The RV's lights flickered, and I felt a searing pain in my chest, as if invisible hands were clawing at me. I grabbed the box, desperate to do something, anything, to make it stop. "What do you want?" I screamed. And the shadows paused, their shapes coalescing into a single towering figure. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and its voice was deep, echoing in my skull. "Your soul, your guilt, your pain, you will stay." I realized then that the spirit wasn't Sarah. It was something older, something evil, feeding on my grief and regret. The box had been its prison, and I had foolishly set it free. Summoning every ounce of courage I had left, I grabbed the box and ran outside. The forest was alive with movement, the trees twisting and groaning as if trying to stop me. I doused the box in gasoline and set it alight. The fire roared to life, consuming the box and its contents. The shadows screamed, their forms writhing and dissipating as the flames grew. The forest fell silent once more. When dawn broke, the box was nothing but ash. The forest felt different, lighter, quieter, but I wasn't the same. The spirit had taken something from me. My memories of Sarah, once vivid and comforting, were now fragmented, like an old photograph faded by time. Her face, her voice, they were slipping away. I packed up the RV and left to Wichita that morning, vowing never to ignore my instincts again. The open road stretched before me, but for the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Hope. Sometimes at night, I still hear whispers, but they're fading, just like my memories of that cursed forest. And though it hurts to lose pieces of Sarah, I know now that holding on to the past can be more dangerous than letting it go. My name is Allison Monroe, and I was 32 years old when it happened. I've told this story a few times, but people tend to think I'm exaggerating, or worse, lying. I'm not. What happened in Red Rock Canyon changed my life, and I'll never forget the whispers, the shadows, or the overwhelming silence of that place. It was August 2021, during one of the hottest summers on record. I was on assignment for Travel Paths magazine, writing a feature about hidden camping spots in Oklahoma. As a freelance travel writer, I prided myself on uncovering unique locations, places people might never think to explore. Red Rock Canyon Adventure Park, with its rugged beauty and rich history, seemed like the perfect destination. The trip started with a hiccup. My RV broke down about 5 miles from the main campground, sputtering to a stop just as I crested a hill overlooking the canyon. I cursed under my breath and tried the ignition again. Nothing. The only sound was the distant hum of cicadas. "Great," I muttered, checking my phone. No signal. With no other options, I decided to camp there for the night. The spot wasn't ideal, no facilities, no easy access to water, but I'd come prepared for roughing it. After setting up a small fire and arranging my supplies, I took in the view. The canyon walls glowed red in the fading light, casting long, jagged shadows across the dry ground. It was beautiful, but there was something oppressive about the silence. That night, I heard the whispers for the first time. I was sitting by the fire jotting down notes in my journal when a faint sound caught my ear. At first, I thought it was the wind, soft, distant murmurs that seemed to rise and fall like a breeze. But the longer I listened, the clearer it became. Words. I couldn't make them out, but there was a cadence to them, like chanting. I stood, scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. My flashlight cut through the shadows, revealing nothing but rocky ground and dry brush. "Hello," I called out. My voice sounded too loud, too intrusive against the stillness. The whispers stopped. The next morning, I decided to explore the area. With the RV still dead and no phone signal, I figured I might as well make the most of my time. Hiking into the canyon, I was struck by how desolate it felt. The air was hot and heavy, and the stillness from the night before lingered like a weight on my chest. About a mile in, I stumbled upon something strange. A series of pictographs etched into the canyon walls. They weren't the kind you'd find in a textbook, no hunting scenes or abstract shapes. These were detailed and unsettling. A group of figures huddled together, their faces twisted in fear, while a larger, shadowy figure loomed above them. I took a photo with my camera, thinking it might make for an interesting sidebar in my article. As I reached out to touch one of the carvings, a chill ran through me despite the heat. "Do not disturb them." I spun around, startled. An older man stood a few feet away wearing a faded ranger's uniform. His face was weathered, his eyes sharp. "Sorry," I said, lowering my hand. "I didn't mean to." He raised a hand to cut me off. "This is a sacred place. It's best not to linger." Before I could respond, he turned and walked away, disappearing around a bend in the canyon. I called after him, but he didn't stop. Something about his presence left me uneasy, though I couldn't say why. That night, back at the RV, I noticed my flashlight was gone. I could have sworn I left it by the fire, but it was nowhere to be found. Frustrated, I rummaged through my supplies, only to discover my journal was missing too. I stepped outside, scanning the ground with a backup flashlight. That's when I saw it, my journal, lying a few feet from the RV. The edges were singed, as though it had been near a fire, and several pages were missing. "What the hell?" The whispers returned, louder this time. They seemed to swirl around me, just beyond the reach of the firelight. "Who's there?" I demanded, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. The whispers faded, leaving only silence. The next day, I decided to hike deeper into the canyon. I told myself I was just looking for inspiration for my article, but the truth was, I wanted answers. The whispers, the strange carvings, the missing pages, they didn't feel like coincidences. About 2 miles in, the air grew thick and stifling, as though the canyon itself was pressing down on me. I rounded a bend and froze. The world around me had changed. The dry, rocky canyon floor was gone, replaced by soft grass and vibrant wildflowers. The air smelled of smoke, and the faint sound of drums echoed in the distance. Ahead of me, a group of people, men, women, and children, hurried through the canyon, their faces etched with fear. They were dressed in traditional native attire, their movements frantic. As I watched, a shadowy figure emerged from the cliffs above, its form indistinct but radiating menace. The people scattered, their screams piercing the air. Then, as suddenly as it began, the vision vanished. I was back in the desolate canyon, the grass and flowers replaced by dry dirt. My legs felt weak, and I sank to the ground, trying to steady my breathing. That night, I was visited by her. I was sitting in the RV, staring blankly at the remnants of my journal, when the air grew cold. A soft glow filled the space and a figure appeared, a woman, her features both human and otherworldly. She wore traditional clothing, her eyes filled with sorrow. "You must write the truth," she said, her voice like the wind. I stared at her, unable to speak. "They took everything from us," she continued. "Our lives, our stories, our voices. Do not let them be forgotten." The glow intensified, and for a moment I saw it all. The massacre, the fear, the cries of a people erased from history. When the vision ended, the woman was gone, and I was left with a single thought. I had to tell their story. The spirits weren't done with me. As I packed my things, preparing to leave, the RV shook violently. Shadows flickered across the walls, forming shapes of people, men, women, and children, their faces contorted in anger and pain. "Remember us," they whispered. "Remember us." I shouted, begging them to stop, but the shaking only grew worse. The windows cracked and the shadows closed in. "I will," I screamed. "I promise." The shaking stopped and the shadows receded. The air felt heavy, charged, as though the spirits were waiting to see if I would keep my word. When I finally left Red Rock Canyon, I carried more than just my camera and camping gear. In my bag was an old, tattered journal I didn't recognize, filled with entries written in a language I couldn't read. On the final page, in English, were the words, "We were here. Do not forget us." When I submitted my article, I included the story of the vanished tribe, their carvings, and their plea for remembrance. My editor called it haunting and poignant, though I left out the parts no one would believe. Even now, years later, I sometimes hear the whispers in my dreams, and every time I do, I remember my promise. They will not be forgotten.